So, welcome everybody to this very special evening, a topic that is very, very dear to my heart in the series of Integral Talks hosted by the Integral Forum and our co-host for tonight, Jeremy Johnson. I'm really, really touched to see you all here coming together and summarizing not only the work of the editorial publishing of the Integral Forum of this year, but also my personal kind of life journey. So I will start with a small story of my life and then look forward for us to share and investigate and explore on the topic of becoming the planetary. I will introduce you all, or please introduce yourselves as we talk, as we go on. But for the moment, I will just say, welcome everyone. Fantastic, we are here. A true web of meaning, a true web of meaning. Susanne, I wrote my book Soul Skin. Here it is. A couple of years ago, deeply inspired by your work. And you are not just the president of Honor to the Integral Academy, which I hold in Germany or host. You're also an amazing expert of development, integral work, a speaker, a writer. And I think for many of us, it's just a pure pleasure as we can get to talk to you and share with you. As I started writing the book, Soul Skin, it was about a woman who decided to shed her skin, to go on wandering the wild, wandering the land, and go on a quest. And so a dear friend of most of us, Tom Mark, became my publisher. Actually, he was my publisher even before I was intending to write a book. He said, I want you to write this book. And I said, what about? And he said, I don't care. It has to be about intensity, your intensity. And so I started writing, not knowing what about, and he sent me your papers, Susanne, ongoingly, and saying, it's not much I want that you do other than bring her work into your writing and use new language, and then write about your life as to become. In that time, I was still living downtown. I had 3 kids. I was working with the animals, with the horses and the dogs. And the journey took me as writing Soul Skin through all the different stages of a woman leaving her home, leaving her children, leaving identification and her culture even, and ending up in the middle of the book in the kind of nowhere land, which was a land where she no longer knew was she of the living or of the unliving. And there the sentient beings started speaking to her, and furthermore, for the second half of the book, guided her path to the point at the end where she returned to the world, not knowing if she still was. I decorated that last chapter in coral colors of the ocean. And her quest in that last chapter really was the question, so now that I have returned, am I still or am I one of the many? And it kind of ends with her realizing she is the eagle and she is the foam of the ocean and she is the destruction of the volcano, as much as also her very unique individual self. I ended the book, that was clear before I started writing, with Mira Alfasa's quote. And I've been very, very inspired by Sat Prem, which I still think Sat Prem is totally underestimated in the topic we're speaking today. Sat Prem was Mira Alfasa's companion or assistant, and he wrote incredible books about his life with her. Saying that, of course, there's a lot of other fantastic writers and stories who taken my heart. So at that point, Sophie, welcome to be here. At this point of my life, you are the most inspiring writer I come across. The power of your deep eco-psychological word using or framing is just so stunning, and I just can't read enough, and very excited to hear you speak to us. And of course, Michael, on the other hand, you're a We Space holder and a man of the ocean, coming from ocean aquatic therapy with people of all ages. And we've shared a little bit before upon the question how the oceanic being in your work, in also the therapeutical work, but also in the well-being. You're just off to your retreat that you're teaching in Greece, and I wished I could be there. So wonderful to have you here. You're also a salon lead holder of the Integral Forum in Munich. And we spoke a lot about the question, Michael, is We Space practices something that concerns us psychologically or spiritually, or why not more in the integral scene does it incorporate the non-human and all types of sentient beings? So my question, which I shared deeply with Jeremy Johnson recently, was what is happening right now that people like Daniel and Jeremy show up with amazing books, which I think will go really, I mean, Jeremy already, when one reads the praise of your actual and last books, and also Daniel Christian Wahl, I think what you're writing on is so much needed, so much to be heard, and crucially to be heard. So what we wanted to explore, Jeremy Johnson and I, was really the question, what is the difference that this is happening now, coming to the development of consciousness and maturing and going through different stages? And why is it different to mere activism? Or you might hear the noise outside, it's the farmers getting the grass. They're good farmers, kind-hearted, they're caring for the land, but they're not feeling part of the land. So what is happening that Jeremy and Daniel, you're writing books where you deeply call for that connectedness and we space with the belived, the unlived, the visible and invisible. And to start the topic there, I have a very specific question to you, Jeremy Lent. I was raised from my grandfather, who was a hunter, taught by the Kalahari Bushmen. And so a lot of what we talk about has been in my childhood very naturally. The book Wolf Totem by Jung, I don't know if I say his name right, is a book that made me a different person regarding the topic we are talking about, in the sense as he describes in this incredible novel how we've become domestic, how we've become agricultural beings, how we lost the interrelatedness of the last tribes in Mongolia living with the wolves. And he writes this whole book out of the perspective also of a wolf. So, Jeremy, I know you are the person to ask what has happened in civilization, in our culture, that we are where we now are now tonight, that we can speak about these things and that we can think about these things in the way you do in your incredible books. So I'll mute myself for this moment and open the dialogue and hand over to you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that fabulous introduction to all these themes today, Cordula. And yeah, I guess, well, let me just sort of kick off, I guess, by offering actually what I begin my book, The Web of Meaning, with, which is actually the Taoist sort of answer to your question there, like what happened to humans, what happened to our civilization? Because in Taoism, they have this really wonderful concept of Wu Wei, which is very similar to what you were just describing in terms of a sort of a pre-civilization type of way of being. And the Taoists saw as Wu Wei, that we can translate that as kind of effortless action. And they saw that really as the way in which the natural world just naturally acted. That what they called its de, or its like natural power of being. And something happened with humans, right? And what happened with humans in the Taoist perception is we developed a consciousness that they called Yue, like a purposive consciousness. And that was the kind of mental activity that caused us to develop language, or in their words, to use a pump to push water uphill, which is like going against the flow of nature. And from the Taoist point of view, yes, that was the cause of civilization and culture, but that was like a crime against the Tao. And all that has been done since then has been to move us away from the Tao, which is why this notion of acting in Wu Wei, this really going with the flow, it's almost like a mystical path for a human being, because we get so much drawn into our purposive way of thinking. And of course, in modern cognitive neuroscience, they've corroborated what the Taoists said. That Yu Wei way of thinking, from an evolutionary point of view, you can see it in our enlarged prefrontal cortex, which is what mediates our symbolic thought, and a sense of a split personality, a sense of a conceptual self and an animate self. And a lot of what I think we see in our Western-dominated worldview is actually in the West, the identity of the human being got to be solely connected with that Yu Wei way of thinking, or what Descartes, in his words, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Identity itself was that symbolic thought, which made all other living beings not really real. They didn't have a true existence. They were just machines, basically. And even we as humans were split. We existed within a machine-like body, which has been something that modern Western quasi sort of scientific thought, which has taken mainstream science, continues to tell us these kind of false notions of our split. So that's just perhaps a good way to sort of set off that context of looking at how that Taoist interpretation has been really corroborated by modern Western understanding in modern scientific investigation.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. And it's just as a brief introduction for myself, it's just an honor to speak with you, Jeremy, and everyone here. I'm just so excited to be having this conversation. As a way to kind of continue to open this up for all of us, I kind of want to do like a micro relational synthesis as we're all kind of coalescing here in a very interesting moment. We just decided on the title, Becoming Planetary, is just a poetic turn of phrase I had labeled in an essay I wrote, and I suggested it to Cordula and sounded about right. But it's a kind of endless exegesis in the sense of, well, how do we become planetary? How do we be planetary? As a poetic statement, an existential statement, it is inviting a conversation about our planetary conditions. It's inviting a conversation about our phenomenological, our relational, our sense of identity in terms of the planetary, right? Because we do seem to be affected by what's going on in the world right now in this deep phenomenological way, which Jeremy, you are speaking to in your book about this kind of what are the conditions of this flawed worldview, and then what are the conditions of this emergent integrated worldview. And that's one of the most exciting places that I hope we can talk about today. But we seem to be invited or initiated into embodying and then learning how to articulate and communicate and design this new worldview together. So many of us are doing this in our own particular forms of expression, poetic, scientific, sometimes both. So these conditions seem to involve all of us. And by all of us, I'm thinking of a science fiction book, a particular line by Arcady Martin, and a memory called Empire, which is how wide is your definition of we? So it seems to involve all of us. It seems to involve the planetary, the human, and the non-human. But in our context, there is this reworking and rewriting of our ontology, phenomenology, relationship with the non-human world. And it doesn't seem to be just affecting, let's say, folks in Western Europe or the knowledge traditions of Western Europe, right? Or the Anglo world, particularly. It's everybody. So there's that, but we have in our particular communities articulations like we've been describing here, new worldviews, emergent mentalities, regenerative turns. We have in the integral community a sense of a developmental worldview in terms of new stages of consciousness and new stages of development that often talk about becoming world-centric, right? So that's one of the tensions I'm very interested in us exploring, because on the one hand, our felt sense of this being a change, or as Gebser talks about, a mutation in consciousness, seems to be ecumenical and it's something that everyone is undergoing. And on the other hand, we do talk about particular stages of development, et cetera. So that's sort of an interesting tension that I'm hoping we can play with a little bit, particularly with Susanne here. Just a great admirer of your work, Susanne. And I sense, and I have felt, and I have heard you articulate this tension in a very insightful way. So I'm going to jump to you in a moment, but just to kind of wrap up this little statement. For this regenerative turn, right, how do we best articulate what this actually means? And maybe all of us as panelists can explore what going planetary, becoming planetary means to us from our particular body of work. What would this mean in terms of an integral ecology? And then how do we, this is me as like the movement builder thinker, but like, how do we help each other, right? How do we become effective at this? What is needed in terms of the educational, the poetic, the psycho-spiritual, the developmental? All of it seems to need to be on the table today. So that's my kind of meta context there. But I love to kind of just jump to Susanne maybe for a moment to sort of explore this tension, right? We have this planetary turn that seems to involve us all, but we also have these very rich traditions of development and emergence. So maybe you can
First of all, now my bookshelf has a whole pile more of books I need to read. Thank you all. I haven't met some of you, and I'm just also pleased to be with you. I'm a little anxious because I'm not a writer, and I'm, well, not, I want to say was I'm not. The question you asked about who is my family, who do I consider my brother, is one that we have thought about it a lot. And if you wish, I can just tell you early on, what language should I use? Opportunist, strategist, or what serves you? Colors. Red would say nobody is my brother, only what serves me and only others as far as they help me survive. Stage 3 or diplomat would say all like situated people. My own kin, family, tribe, neighborhood, club, team, social organizations. So the like situated folks are my kin, and for those I care. And for others, they're outside. The next level, the expert, stage 3, 4, like interested. People with similar training, similar focus, similar expertise, professional peers, and associations. We hang together, we know what's what, we know we will solve your problems. We have the technical know-how and whatever know-how we need. The next stage, the one that's most common in the West, stage 4, looks at like-minded people, people in my own society, culture, others with similar goals, values, methods of inquiry, and beliefs. And the very great energy in trying to make the world a better place. That's the most often heard phrase we read in tests. And that goes across the board, but mostly this without realizing yet that we as the instruments need to evolve in order to be the best transmitter and the best people to make a difference. It's not just how to solve outside. And that's about 80% of what we see in worldwide population. And then we have maybe 20% that we call post-conventional. And probably all of us here belong to that tribe. And that has stage 4-5 individualist or pluralist, which I would think the we space is more pluralistically interested. And that says everyone is my brother, but especially, and listen to the but especially those who also respect diversity and our unique differences. So there's still a hierarchical ordering in it. Then the next, much rarer, like principled folks, regardless of culture, color, age, status, capacity, beliefs, background, or life situation, we are all connected in one way or another because we're part of multiple nested systems that influence us. The economy somewhere in Singapore affects us just as much as here in the long run. And having that knowledge is an important piece, but there are few of us. Even integral is still small compared to the rest of the world. And then next we have higher than 5 and later, whatever you want to call it, like spirited folks. All humans, all sentient beings are my kin. I am part of the history of evolution and the universe. We are all one. And that's maybe 1% of the population that I encounter. So we're still small. And I don't say we shouldn't have greater embrace. But it's hard to help people care about others that are not part of their particular group, their particular kinship, kindred, humankind. All these words are related. So that's what I wanted to say for the beginning. I'm very keenly aware that I may be the contrarian voice in here because I'm a little older or because that's part of what I've been acting as, is an elder and a reflector and sometimes a deflector of all that positivism and idealism that I see. So I will mostly be quiet so I can drink in your positivism. How is that?
Oh, wonderful, Susanne. Thank you. And you're setting up, I think, the rest of this conversation because that's kind of the context that all of us here, Daniel, Jeremy, Sophie, and Michael, I'm just all of us here in talking about a regenerative turn in this context. I mean, who among us in our human population are actually really stretching their sense of self into the non-human, into the planetary, into the being ecological? But I think that here's the interesting thing where maybe Daniel wants to jump in here as well, and then maybe Sophie and Michael as we explore and then I'd like to come back to Jeremy to kind of articulate this integrated worldview. But Daniel, so much of your work is on the designing and the creative and the kind of really looking at all of the different dimensions and factors and systems that go into this restructuring. And I want to highlight the emphasis that you bring into your work and that a lot of regenerative folks bring into their work, that in spite of it being particularly rarefied in terms of a human cultural expression, somehow we've got to find a way to transition as a species, regardless of any particular. So, you know what I mean? Like whatever stage we may be at, everyone's going to have to, at the existential and subsistence level, be living and being shaped by the new conditions of this century and of the Anthropocene. So I'll just kind of leave that open-ended there. Daniel, if you want to take that and run with it. And, yeah.
Right. Well, this has already been a gift. It's been a really hot and long day, and I was quite exhausted, but I've got all the energy back just listening to you in the last 20 minutes or so. For me, I'm sitting with a question here, and this is a wonderful group of people to ask this question, which is somehow I've got to the point, because of what Susanne has said, that it's so easy to get skewed by conversing within one's own echo chamber with a few people and thinking, wow, we're there. It's beautiful. They're all getting it. Yeah? And then to sit on the bus and listen into a conversation, what people care about in their daily lives, and just hear things that you just kind of suddenly hit the wall of not everybody thinks alike. And I mean, Susanne was somewhat speaking to it also with this, the different voices we need to communicate this journey in order to pick people up where they're at and not where we want them to be. But there's another dimension to it, which is maybe we need to completely give up. I think all of us agree that we won't shift 100% of humanity to these higher levels of the spiral, because it's not even what makes sense, because each individual goes through that journey and all of them are always co-present. But the one thing that I feel like we've been a little bit blind on is to understand that we still have a narrative. When I'm now going to talk about indigenous wisdom cultures, there's a knee-jerk response. There's another one talking about the golden days of the past and harking back to the tribal being in harmony with nature. But maybe we should slow down that a bit and say, how deeply colonialized have we been in our narrative? And if we hold possible that through all of human history, in different percentages, maybe not, all these levels of the spiral, or the map that Gebser and spiral dynamics and Wilbur and all the different forms we have of that map, that they are co-present, then maybe what we actually have to think about is what, like for me, it's really important when we talk about regenerative cultures, that we don't frame it as something new that has arrived, just the new kid on the block that now everybody wants to talk about. For me, it's very much a remembering that for 99% of our species history, we have walked as bioregional nurturers, syntrophic forces in our ecosystem, or not our ecosystem, the ecosystem that we were expressions of. The entire perspective shifts from we own this land to we are living expressions of this land, where at very best custodians, caretakers, stewards, whatever the name we can give it in our language. And if we then understand that really this is a coming back into the long evolutionary journey that worked for our species, and that we're just a little bit skewed with our perception of time as human beings, judging it to our own lifetimes. Really, 5,000 years is not that much, and a few hundred years is very little. And we've just taken a detour into a narrative that has worked to generate all sorts of technologies and insights, but it's taken us away from who we really are. And with Cordula being a Jungian therapist, I'd actually love to hear you speak a little bit about Jung's 4 ways of knowing, because I feel all of this mapping and also the whole integral field can have the danger of being too much still in the thinking space, and then the mapping and creating the drawers to put people in. And how would we come back to sensing, feeling, intuiting as the other 4 ways of knowing, the basic ways of knowing that have informed being in place as stewards for millennia, for all our species history. And it's actually the recovery of these abilities of how to be in place. And that's the paradox of what we're talking about this evening, which with becoming planetary. There is only one way to become planetary, which is, I love Gary Snyder's term, reinhabitation. The beautiful American poet who used this term in the early bioregionalist movement in the 1970s in his poetry, he speaks of becoming place again, of re-inhabiting our place, our body, our communities, our bioregions. And really that is the process of re-indigenization, of becoming indigenous. We're all indigenous to life. There is no divide between indigenous and non-indigenous people. We're indigenous to life. But the young brothers, our journey has been one of a detour that has created all sorts of abilities and gifts. But now is the time that we really stop thinking of what we mistakenly called primitive cultures as something that is in the past and has no value, and actually remember that they have been the custodians and are still the custodians of most of the key ecosystems on the planet and most of the biodiversity on the planet. And we need to align with that. And for me, that becoming planetary is actually becoming local. And it's what Jeremy was saying, it's stepping back into the Wu way. It's ultimately working on ourselves to the point of saying, how can life flow through me? And how can I understand my own agency in this system as something that is eternal, that I'm part of a larger agency, which is life as a planetary process. And if I can align with that, then I can take myself a lot less serious and work in very different ways. And I don't want to get too long here. So maybe Cordula, can you pick up on the 4 ways of knowing? That would be super.
Well, I go to it from another direction, if that's okay. And then I really would like to hear Sophie on that. Yeah, when you ask that question, to me some other answer came up, which was the Jungian way. What was it for me? Well, it was the way into solitude, really, the way into the inner world, which, and that's a question also I like to put into our round, was a tremendously scary, terrorizing feeling. I mean, when I wrote that book, and I'm still living in wilderness ever since, I came across places inside me, archaically, collectively, in whatever way I describe that in my book, these moments or years of the pain of shedding the skin from the identification of belonging to this or that. And I don't know if it always has to be this gateway that is so torturing almost, you know. I mean, sometimes I felt if I'm going to stay stuck in this, that's really terrible. And the Jungian work helps me, and when I work with people, is generally to break up our identification with cultural narratives, biological narratives, upbringing, education, and whatsoever. And I'm working especially in the tradition of voice dialogue, which is the work with sub-personalities, which can also be all sentient beings. If you spread the we space of my own we space, my identity, further to the we space, which goes collective, archaic, and in all realms. And being in those spaces in the work I'm doing, I cannot help bear witnessing that it's always a very painful process to lose that sense of belonging. And I think that's where I kind of leave it here and hand over to Sophie. The sense of belonging is a crucially painful experience, but in my feeling, it's necessary to go through this transformative metamorphosis in order to find that expanded sense of self and non-self and hold that tension at all times. I am and I am not. Sophie, so maybe you can say something to that, and also please answer to where do you draw your writings from? I need to know. Where does the inspiration come from and how do you go about it? Just tell us something about you.
Which would you like me to do first?
whatever feels good for you.
Well, I mean, I think they both probably are interconnected. First, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone here. I feel honored. I just want to soak in all of the different perspectives. I think of myself as a compost heap. When you throw enough stuff on, something sprouts. So you guys are all adding to the compost heap. Thank you. Daniel, I really, really agree with everything you say. And something I've been really sitting with is mentioned in Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, which is I don't want movements that are a mile wide and an inch thick, an inch deep. I want movements that are an inch wide and a mile deep. And I've been thinking about how we can create a depth of an experience that we can drop back into our bodies and into our local experience and drop out of our egos into our root systems. How can we kind of, it's something that I have a genetic degenerative illness that has no cure. And so for me, the idea of evolution and of progress and of a narrative that has some kind of hero's journey propulsion has never adhered to my life. And when I've tried to live it, it has been profoundly dissonant and agonizing. And for me, I'm much more interested in, I read this essay by this scientist in this compendium, a book called The Art of Living on a Damaged Planet. It was put out by University of Minnesota Press. And it was about how we thought these sea cucumbers were less evolved than other creatures because they didn't have a brain or a nervous system like the other ones, but they'd actually gotten rid of them. They'd simplified. And so something I'm really interested in is kind of queering our idea of progress and of developmental stages. Like my body is degenerating. I experience a certain level of decay. And then on a very personal psychological level, I've experienced narrative melting. You know, I live between stories. My intelligence is interstitial, which is, you know, I have a connective tissue disease and I'm very interested in fungi, which are the connective tissue of the soil, which is how do I live interstitially? How do I live between health and non-health, death and life? I'm not evolving, I am decaying, but decay is a kind of revision. It's a kind of fermentation. But to end and talk about how my writing comes to me, I've been really interested in the idea of the fungi Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, cordyceps, that infects ants and insects and coordinates their behavior. It doesn't take over their brain, but it takes over their whole body. And it inspires them to climb up stalks of grass and bite into a certain vein, and then they freeze and the fungus sprouts out of their head and sporulates. So they become, by the end of their life, they are, I think Merlin Sheldrake writes in his book, you know, they are a fungus wearing an ant costume. And something I've been thinking about as a writer is I think perhaps human narratives they've had a center stage for a long time. How do we decenter them? How do I ask what I want to provide a mouth for? So the process of writing recently has been like, I've really tried to open myself up and say, okay, what if I'm not the main character? What story wants to be told? And how do I let it come through me, even if it's perhaps a uncomfortable experience? So discomfort is definitely the inspiration behind a lot of my writing, which then it'll be a contraction and then an opening of empathy that is not constrained by any kind of developmental achievement or bounded individuality. You know, I'll finish this with just symbiogenesis, the idea that, you know, single cellular organisms fuse to create our very cells is very helpful for me. I'm not so much interested in achieving some kind of level of universal homogenized agreement. I'm interested in tying myself to other species, to species that are going extinct, to landscapes that are going to extinct, to, you know, the plot that they're digging up behind my house. I'm interested in marrying myself to mountains. How can I merge in a way that isn't necessarily beautiful and collaborative, but perhaps messy and culpable? Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, Sophie. Thank you. I just wanted to mention just a few connecting strands here before we jump to Michael and then Jeremy, and then I'd love to come back to Susanne too in terms of this weaving of response and articulation and nuance here about everything we're talking about. But Daniel, I just want to also affirm a lot of agreement and resonance everything you stated as well. Something I'm working on in my particular book, my tradition is coming more from Jean Gebser's work, and Gebser articulates these structures of consciousness in a little bit different way than a stage-centric model, in that if you look at his writing, they're almost like an ecology or a sort of symbiogenesis, where the structures are like little organelles that are all kind of interrelating and flowing into one another and becoming one another and giving each other energy, rather than as a particular developmental process. And the unfolding that we've seen, let's say archaic, magic, mythic, integral, mental integral, is chronologically interesting, but it's almost besides the point when you get the sense of this interrelated aliveness of these different dimensions of being and relating to the world, and whether it's more mental, directive oriented thinking, or magical resonant cognition and vital aliveness, they are co-needed and not necessarily one above the other, but complementary to one another. So in my book that I'm working on right now, I'm coming up with something, I'm playing around with different metaphors, complementary developments, just in terms of when we talk about indigenous complexity and indigenous science, you're right, everything we're learning about our ancestors and present indigenous communities is that there are particular forms of mastery in relationship with the non-human world as stewards, whether we're talking about the Amazon rainforest or the controlled fires, controlled burning in North America. Human beings, when we extend a kind of creative capacity to work with the non-human world at the level of the planetary, human beings have been doing it, as you say, just for our whole species story. And we've been doing it in ways that we don't even know how to do anymore in terms of, what our common knowledge practices are in a global industrial civilization. So I'm very much in agreement that it seems that this integral or regenerative or planetary turn is really kind of folding in this history of extraction or apartness back into this longer arc of human becoming and human evolution, which lived in a much more place-based and bioregional way. So the linearity kind of fades away. It becomes besides the point. It's well, how do we bring them together, right? How do we fold these different orientations, whether we call them structures or stages, in terms of scientific knowledge and everything we have that is wonderful, especially for me, geeking out about biology and astronomy and cosmogenesis in terms of like the origins of life itself. It's all wonderful stuff. Like I want us to be exploring the cosmos and doing that kind of thing. But also it does seem like there is a return to this regenerative, place-based, indigenous complexity that is integral to becoming integral, and not as something that's like coming back to that at a higher level, but literally a kind of symbio becoming, So that's what I'm really interested in articulating in my book. And I think it's very present in Gebser's work in a kind of prescient way, since he was writing in the 1940s and 50s. But so I'm seeing this in so much of our articulation here, this kind of becoming with, like Dana Haraway talks about, the symbiogenesis or sympoesis of becoming with, I think is a more appropriate description for what we are learning to do as a civilization right now in so many ways. But to kind of flow into Michael's question, I'm all of that, Michael, in terms of what is our definition of we, how do you sense into this becoming planetary? And I would just love to hear a little bit. I'm not as familiar with your work, just a little bit from Cordula, so I'd love to hear you as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Cordula, for inviting me. So I see you people, smart people, everybody wrote books, and I'm not. So what can I contribute? I practice oceanic bodywork since 25 years. So we bring people into warm water, body temperature, and we move them above and underwater. So thoughts can be dissolved, and they came to more to perceive what's happening with their body and their emotions. And it is possible to connect to a oceanic feeling. And this can cause, for instance, pre- or transpersonal material. And it needs conversation, coaching after these sessions to give this experience sense, and the people they it is the stages are important to interpret the oceanic flow, so they can hold it and they can look what they how they transform it into their daily life. And this practice, Oceanic Bodywork Aqua, is for the individual. We work 2 by 2, 1 by 1, and my theme is how can we create we-space in groups, and not only on the we have the gross body, like we are here in the Zoom room. It's our gross body to meet. And we have the subtle body where the feelings and thoughts and perceptions appear, emerges. And then we have the causal body, which is formless, and it's realm of the witness. So everything appears in this space. So I have my T-shirt on. It's I'm the space in this. Everything is emerging. So when I connect to this causal body, I can hold my subtle body and my gross body. And in the V space, I want to come from our gross body, our gross experience, like here in the Zoom room, over the subtle body where we are connected and we are feeling, and we are sharing authentic feelings, to the causal bodies. I call it causal V-space. So it's an authentic sharing, a deep sharing, and everybody is can see him or herself in the others. So when you speak, Jeremy, I feel that's my words. So you are speaking from my heart. So, and this is a feeling of connectedness during a session. It's a state, and it emerges and it disappears. So it's my training. How can we train this kind of V-space? Thank you all. Thank you for listening. So you give me the space for emerging. Thank you.
Michael, just one question. Listening to your describing the situation in the water reminds me very much when, now I'm not working anymore in one-to-one sessions as a psychotherapist, but I'm only working with the horses as co-therapists. And so it's a similar thing, like when people come in the horse field, it can be 1 horse or 7, we bring them into the hall, and the horses actually love that work, and they really take over the situation. So I'm just holding the space, and the horses, they go and do things and do constellation work and touch and indicate what is the next step. And so I have to film it one day because it's unbelievable. They're really coherently thinking along in their somatic experience, in their animistic self. And the healing or the transformation that happens for the people is such a different one than when I would do this on a one-to-one human level only. So that is the one thing I wanted to add to what you said. And then also bringing it back to Daniel and also Jeremy, something that I think, connects us three very much, and I'd like to hear from you, Jeremy Lent, afterwards. The thing is, isn't it a problem that we think the human is so super important, plainly said, and that when we talk about these things, I was so affected already 15 years ago from Aurobindo, because that one quote he said, we are being in becoming, and that what we are to become might not be a human. That might not be this. This might look completely different. This might be an intermixing self with, like Sophie describes it, with all fungi and animalistic things, and who knows. But since I accepted that fact, I am transitory, things changed greatly for me. So isn't much of the problem as what we're discussing here, one that we tend to look at all these problems, opportunities and possibilities from a mere human type of edification setup. So I know, Daniel, I just translated one of your articles where you very much, I was very happy to find my thinking reassured. But Jeremy, what do you think about this?
Yes, I think that there is this important theme I see coming across through this conversation, similar to what you were just bringing up, Cordula, is this sense of we need to be really careful about this sense of hierarchies, which we impose and then puts us on the top. And, I think that is true both in terms of anthropocentrism and this it's as if there's this deep ideology in our global culture of human supremacy, which just takes for granted that the rest of nature is there for our benefit. And again, has come mostly from the Western way of thinking, which has become this kind of globalized worldview. But I think just as important is, even within our own human species, is needing to be really careful about setting up these hierarchies of development, which somehow, whenever you see any kind of hierarchy of development discussed, it's always seems to be the person who is coming up with that hierarchy who sees themselves at the top. I haven't seen too many hierarchies where somebody sets up this hierarchy and says, I'm only like way down below, but others are on top. So it tends to be oftentimes, the white European and many cases, or the white male European who sort of sees himself as the culmination of something. So we see humans as the culmination of evolution, and then the sort of white European way of thinking as some sort of culmination. These are what we have to be so careful of. And I love what you were saying, Sophie, about the notion that evolution itself doesn't necessarily lead towards increased complexity. We do believe there's this kind of arrow, or so many people believe there's this kind of arrow of evolution towards increased complexity. And I do think that's largely true, but even that being the case doesn't mean that greater complexity is better in some way, in some sort of normative way. And what I'd like to sort of inject in this kind of conversation is this theme that comes really across centrally in my book, is the theme of integration as a way of understanding how we can have all these different parts working together. And we can sort of take our inspiration on this from nature itself. When you look at everything in nature, from a single cell to an organism to an ecosystem, integration is key in the sense of sort of defining it, to paraphrase what Dan Siegel talks about when he talked about integration, is this notion of unity with differentiation. And so on the one hand, there's always this kind of drive. People say, oh, we need to recognize we're all one. And then people respond to that saying, well, I don't feel like I'm all one. What about, I don't want to lose my individuality and all this kind of stuff. And the beauty of this notion of integration is it incorporates both the separation and the differentiation with the unity. And like in the cells in our bodies, they share the same DNA, they work together, but cells are incredibly different from each other in doing what they do. And similarly, I think when we look at that, we don't have to even see any sort of human layers of consciousness from a developmental or a normative perspective, in my view. that we can, to your point, Daniel, you know, a lot of the indigenous knowledge is there. It's not something that we have grown from, but we actually lost with the rise in agriculture, and then obviously with the last few centuries of our sort of separation-based scientific worldview. And we need to like regain that. And the important thing to do is to do that in such a way that we're not sort of exploiting those different ways of knowing and somehow, you know, trying to use it for the benefit of that sort of Western way of thinking, and what can we do to incorporate this or that in a way that makes us most comfortable. But again, to your point, Sophie, we need to be ready to deal with the discomfort that some of these things might raise. But I think above all is when we recognize this notion of integration is key, we can also recognize our whole sense of identity and values, not as being we have to get rid of or rise above my sense of individuality or my sense of shared community in this area and get sort of transcend to planetary consciousness. And that's how I really need to be. But I see it more almost as a fractal flowing quality, that a true integrative consciousness is one that can hold all the different layers basically at the same time and just flow from moment to moment from one to the other, almost like we flow from qualia from one to the other. So recognizing my sense of a separate self, if something hits me, I feel it. You don't feel it, I do. To a sense of family, a sense of shared cultures, a sense of shared humanity, and then a sense of sharing with all of life. And not to say that one of those layers is better than the others, but what is truly, I think, can lead to the kinds of that integrative consciousness is that being open to flow within all of them, to embrace them all at the right time in the right place, and to connect them up in a way that's truly coherent. So that's my sense of, you know, how we could approach that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Fantastic. I will return to your point. I would love to have Susanne fold in some responses and thoughts to this conversation.
The idea of integration, and that we are not just higher is better, which is, as I've been speaking against that as long as I know, but that ordinary and special have to come together. We are mortals, we have bodies, we are full of viruses and bacteria, we couldn't live without them. So to embrace that as well, or as you said, with the gross, the subtle, and the causal, all of it is really what's so important, not that we all move up those theoretical stages. I don't really, they seem to be there when you do research, but that doesn't mean much. And when one of you wrote a book about the meaning, you, Jeremy Johnson, who wrote the book about meaning? Anyway, the meaning is
Jeremy Lent, yeah.
Oh, you, Jeremy, sorry. Anyway, that is so important to recognize. And fascinatingly, I would say, with the demise, I even consider the demise of humanity, the demise of our species. It's hard enough to think of personal death, but to actually contemplate the possibility of our species demise, because we have soiled our nest enough with so many different things that yes, maybe some sort of fungus will survive, or some creatures underneath on the bottom of the ocean that have learned to adapt to extreme toxic environments. They may, but maybe we won't. So my pain is mostly around, I'm old enough, I probably won't see the demise. But what about all the children, all the grandchildren, the future generations? What on earth have we given them to deal with? And I find it hard to be positive and say, we're so clever, we will figure it out. And it's okay. Is it okay with any one of you if the human species gets wiped out? And maybe a lot more of the more sophisticated creatures.
Yeah, that's a great pivot for us. I want to speak to that briefly. I've been reading Shreko Horvich's After the Apocalypse, and I've been familiarizing myself with Jem Bendel's work through a scholar I published, Sean Kelly, a book called Becoming Gaia through Integral Imprint. And this is one of the meditations that Sean so wonderfully articulates at the end of his book, which is, how do we live in the context of deep adaptation, sixth greatest extinction, and with the possibility that our species and many other species, this might be it for us, right? In terms of our place in this world. How then ought we to live and relate to the planet? And if I'm understanding Sean's point accurately, what he describes is, it is better to lean into all of the principles we've been talking about today in terms of, well, becoming place-based, bioregional, reflecting on the whole, how we got here, right? How do we live well as spiritual beings on the planet in relation to the non-human in the time that we have, right? And I think no matter what, this is something that has come up in a lot of debates around deep adaptation and Jem Bendel's work, where folks say it's too cynical or it's too nihilist, and it's demoralizing to really say that civilizational collapse is happening and potentially human extinction could happen. And the responses, I think the most constructive ones have been, regardless of whether you think that is an exaggerated claim, if, let's say, there was a possibility that, say, your building was going to go on fire, like, you would do everything you can to prevent that from happening and taking all the precautions. So we should probably be doing everything we can as culturally, poetically, scientifically, institutionally, to prepare for deep adaptation in order to lessen the amount of human and non-human suffering, right? Like, it, as an ethical imperative, there seems to be work there. But then there's also this, as Susanne, you're saying, there's also this kind of readiness as a species, individually and culturally, to embrace death, actually, you know, as this kind of, and this is something Kelly talks about too, Sean Kelly, that we ought to be living as if this is an initiation. And an initiation, you confront death. You confront being, you know, the end of your particular existence in the hopes of renewal. But regardless, you kind of, maybe as Gebser would say in one of his poems, you take death into yourself. You let death sleep in your hand to really kind of overcome that, or not overcome, to live with it, right? And to die with it well. So I'm very interested in maybe we could kind of open it up if anyone wants to kind of popcorn this dimension here. Daniel, yeah.
Wow. I like to think of life as a planetary process, as a nested regenerative community. Meaning that life sustains life, in this beautiful sentence, like Janine Benyus nailed it with this one-liner, life creates conditions conducive to life. That's her summary of studying biomimicry and how to act as life. And since we are life, we are capable of creating conditions conducive to life, and we've forgotten that. And I'm still coming back to what I said earlier, because what I'm interested in is how do we hold that being is always in the polarity of being as an individual, a self, an observer, taking a perspective, and being as the larger whole, and that the two of them are not separate, but that we are actually life as a planetary evolutionary process, and we're a temporary manifestation of it. And so is our culture. And there's nothing so new to me about the news that civilization is collapsing. I think the history of humanity is a gradual process of continuous collapse of one form of civilization and emergence of other ways of being. And so we've been in collapse for a very long time. Like what's his name? Robert Gilman from the In Context Institute has this beautiful image of an era where he speaks about sort of about 5,000, 8,000 years of the tribal era. And then the era of empire, power over, and all that comes in with agriculture, city-states, and then the big empires. And then he actually puts the Renaissance as the point where the planetary era already comes in. And what I like about the graphic is it reframes completely the entire scientific revolution, not as the kind of devil's bargain in the Faustian bargain kind of sense where science and technology gave us the power over nature to destroy the planet, but it shows the other side of that medal is that during that entire scientific journey, we have taken the scientific en route into a spiritual insight that other cultures have had for thousands of years. The Vedanta is full of it, the Tao is full of it. And so we're revisiting these insights from a scientific perspective now. But ultimately, what I'm keep getting back to is this all co-present? Is this always there? We're not, if we take ourselves a little less serious, we're not the point of that evolution, but just some of the people who are waking up to something that maybe 3,000 years other people have already woken up to also. But the urgency of now is that we have pushed our planet to a point where I was floored that the conversation that in part led to me writing my book happened in 2006, 10 years before the book was published. And it was with David Orr in his office in Oberlin College, where I asked him about the spiritual and the dimension of the sacred in the transition towards a sustainable human civilization. And his answer just floored me. And I tell the story in my book. He said, Daniel, before we can answer sufficiently or effectively or wisely how we might sustain human presence on planet Earth and sustain life, and what we might have to do so, we have to ask ourselves a deeper question, which is, why are we worth it? What is it in us? And that's where I feel like, on the one hand, yes, we need to take ourselves a lot less serious. And on the other hand, we need to actually ask that question, is there something in us that, for example, in each ecosystem, what role do we actually play? We have the reflective consciousness that through our way of doing science and thinking and so on, has given us the ability to anticipate that it's 12:05, that if we don't do things differently rapidly now, then we will pay the consequences. And so it also gives us the opportunity, and this is where I'm semi-aligned with the deep adaptation movement. I believe that what they're talking about of coming home to place, building local and bioregional resilience and preparing for a lot of the structures we've grown accustomed to collapse and crumble around us is a sensible thing to do. But it is also possibly the way that we can, as we come home to place and we become healers of the ecosystems we're actually expressions of, again, we start healing the planet place by place. Because one of the things that I learned from the Regenesis group people of their particular deep lineage of working regeneratively is this fundamental shift away from working on problems, because problems always make us abstract more. And then we talk about the planetary problems, and then we have processes like the COP that go on forever with the UN Conference on Climate Change, but do nothing. Because at that level of abstraction, it has no significance. But the minute we talk about working from potential and revealing potential of people, each individual, each one of us has a unique contribution to make to this world that only we have. And it doesn't matter whether we have 10 years, 20, 30, or 100 years to do so. And we still transform the future of this planet in that time. And so if we bring that process, the capacity building process, back into our community and our own field of agency, to say, it's not about creating the perfect world. It's about building capacity in people to continue evolving, continue transforming, to tug on their mask and say, am I still current? Am I still listening? Am I still attuned? Are the patterns I used to have still serving, or am I running a program? And that is evolutionary and regenerative and developmental. But it's not in this negative sense of getting it better all the time. It's all like the future is already here, just unevenly distributed, as William Gibson said. We can instantaneously come home to this place of being all of this, because we are. And it's exactly there where, to my mind, the paradox of death also resolves itself. Goethe said almost 200 years ago that death is life's most ingenious invention to create plenty of life. And it only depends on where you put your emphasis on. Are you life? Are we all life? And what we contribute will have agency over our embodied lifetime? Or are we just these embodied, skin-encapsulated egos? And then Gregory Bateson in 1970 wrote this essay called On Form, Substance, and Difference that was actually included in the Ecology of Mind. And in there, he points out that the unit of survival and evolution is not the individual or the species, but the flexible species and the environment. And that to me speaks to exactly that paradox, that it's not about whether we as humanity survive or whether we as individuals survive, but it also doesn't mean we don't matter. Each and every one matters. Every species has mattered and will matter. And it's just to tie it back to the beginning of what I said earlier. I believe that most indigenous cultures in their own way always understood that. They always knew that the point is to let life flow through us and understand that we're just expressions of it. And then if we really live that on a daily basis, it doesn't matter whether we're going to make it or not, whether it's already too late or not, because it's not about quantity, it's about quality. It's about the quality of relationships, of how we live right now and how much we appreciate every second of it, because it's a gift. And the bizarre thing for me is that if we get to that point, I think we will get through the eye of the needle and actually come out at the other end and unfold the potential of this very young species. And the last thing I'm going to say is, yes, we're in the middle of a species level rite of passage, and it needs us to confront death, because otherwise we're not going to make that. It's that pain that cracks the shell of understanding that we're now going through on a planetary level. And the best way to prepare for that, I think, is coming home to place, reinhabitation. I'll shut up.
Daniel, thank you. Thank you for that so much. I am just like lighting up listening to weaving all of this together for us. And I'm learning so much from you and all of you here. I want to give Jeremy a chance to speak, because I know your schedule is a bit tight right now, and we want to honor that. And yeah, please, I know you're.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I really love what you were saying, Daniel, about this kind of deep connection with all of life, and what the implications of that are. And I guess I just wanted to add a perspective that I feel a imperative to sort of put into this conversation a little bit, because one of the things I see is this potential for as we get focused on that sort of place-based response, which I totally support and endorse, and as we get focused on that sort of deep adaptation response of just looking at some sort of inevitability of collapse, and then focusing attention on what we can do within community to be prepared for that and all that stuff. And I should say, I've also read Sean Keller's book, Becoming Gaia, which I think is a profound reflection on some of these bigger issues that as humans, we've never, ever been in a place to actually consider before. This recognition of the destruction that our own race, or at least part of the people of our own species are doing, and then feeling the massive implications of that. Very profound. But at the same time, I guess maybe coming from this point of view of integration, of the importance of all the different elements, I do feel it's critical when we do have that sense of a planetary consciousness and a shared human consciousness to realize the billions of people on this earth today who actually don't have the luxury to have these kind of conversations, who are dealing right now with all of the devastation that are that basically just sort of 20% of the human species in the global north have sort of put on the rest of the world to cope with. And so right now, you know, while we're talking about the place of death within life, and we're sort of comfortably sitting here in this conversation talking about it, there are so many people out there facing death, facing real death of their loved ones, and so the suffering arising from that because of what is going on and what is unfolding. So I feel it's critically important for us to, as we look at this kind of sense of a planetary consciousness, to look at what the imperative that arises from that. And the imperative is not just to focus on our community, focused on place and regional based solutions, which is essential to it, but also to recognize our part in this great global systems, to recognize that even the COP process, so frustrating, and we all see how, you know, it's not even coming close to what's needed, but all of those things need to be moving forward at the same time. It's a place of luxury and privilege to say, you know, to hell with all these political processes and all these things, let's kind of focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture is also those horribly frustrating political processes. The bigger picture is that these extinctions of species are happening right now, and even if it's too late to avoid certain things, and every single 0.1 of a degree Celsius rise in temperature will have huge impacts over decades to come on other species, on other human lives. And we have to recognize that and somehow hold this drive to engage, and as well as the obvious calling to find a place to hold all these things in a more kind of spiritual way at the same time. So I just want to put that into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Jeremy, I have a question. We have 7 more minutes. In your book, you say, if I understood it right, that all that really was, what you recognized is that the search for meaning was that which was thriving all cultures. So now is my question on the end now. Is the search for meaning our tragedy, or is it something good?
Well, I think that as humans, we can be very grateful for this kind of overdeveloped prefrontal cortex or whatever, which does drive this patterning instinct or the search for meaning that we have. And I think that it's clearly led to a lot of tragic developments. It's led to these imbalances and this potential for the destruction of so much of the abundance of nature and possibly of our own civilization. I'd hold a big question about our species versus our civilization being at risk right now. But I think what we can do, the invitation, is to recognize that that very thing that makes humans different from other creatures, not better, but having a certain type of consciousness that gives us, that empowers us culturally to have this incredible impact on the rest of life. That very difference is what can also enable us to find a place of mutual symbiosis with the rest of life on Earth. We can shift from that anthropocentric human supremacy place of looking at our power to conquer nature and shift to this place to ask, what does the rest of non-human nature want from us as humans? How can we use that power and technology and science to actually act for the mutual benefit of us as humans and the living earth? Not how can we use technology to pollute a little bit less or cause less harm, but how can we actually listen to what life is saying it wants from us as humans? And how can we truly act in this place of mutual symbiosis with this potential. And it's maybe a very tiny potential, but still the potential is there, is to ultimately move from the Anthropocene to what some call the Symbiocene, this notion of an age that could last endlessly longer than any kind of short-lived destructive Anthropocene, of actually humans finding a way to truly be at one in an integrative way with the rest of non-human life on this planet, in a way that we can flourish as humans, but on a flourishing, regenerated Earth. I think that's the invitation, to use that human patterning instinct, that conceptual consciousness, to turn it towards life rather than against life.
Yeah. Wow, Jeremy, thank you so much for that. I wanted to mention before you run, that this is why I've been kind of holding both as well. And that's very much part of your thesis in terms of bringing this as an integrated worldview, that again, it's that symbiotic relationship between becoming more place-based and regenerative, and then also holding in its proper relationship with the whole. Speaking of Taoism, the history of Western science and technology and industry, et cetera, how can that serve this greater whole, this greater planetary life that we're a part of? And maybe to kind of close with a thought from James Lovelock, who brought this up years ago in a talk. For folks who are listening, he was one of the co-authors of Gaia hypothesis, and he worked on that with Lynn Margulis. But he posited this possibility for our species that, at one point, photosynthesis in plants upturned the planet and created this great extinction, right? It really reshaped the entire atmosphere, quite literally. And now we can't think of an Earth without photosynthesis. I mean, it's absurd to even imagine that. So he posits in this like profound optimism for just a moment in one of his talks that what if humans could become as integral to the planets, to Gaia, as plants are to photosynthesis? What is our role? How do we become that? And I just want to leave us with that as a kind of optimistic, constructive, ethical exercise for all of us. But oh my gosh, this could keep going. And I hope this is the first of more conversations, because this is so important.
Yeah. Usually we would like to end with really each of us still just saying what we take with us from this talk, but I think we're really running out of time, and I promised you, Jeremy, to be punctual. So I wouldn't like to continue without you, but there is the heartfelt invitation to explore further in all crossover kind of dialogues. Andreas will join us also for next series. And I do like to, last year I did the same with the issue of politics, that we had a couple of meetings with a few people coming anew and others not coming again. So it can unfold. So please do stay in touch. And
Cordula,
I think we all...
Sorry to hijack this, the last minute. Could I read a poem by Margaret Atwood that really fits to what we've been talking about? Just to tune us out. It's called The Moment. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there, and say, I own this. Is the same moment when the trees unloose their soft arms from around you, the birds take back their language, the cliffs fissure and collapse, the air moves back like a wave, and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor, time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic. And as I've been saying, let's do this again. Let's continue to have these important conversations. And there's so many different avenues and rhizomes to explore here: the poetic, the practice, the design-oriented, the commute. It goes on. So let's continue having these conversations. And all of you have learned so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all. Bye. Have a nice day.